1971 was not just another year, it was the year when invisible chains bound humanity. I, you, and the world are still chained to a system of imperceptible servitude that impacts our lives to this day. That year, there was a complete change in the way society functioned. We were enslaved and didn't even realize that a single country was always behind all of this. To see how it started, we need to look back a bit. 1945. The world was in ruins, physical, moral, and economic ruins. After World War II, Europe was devastated, in debt, and needed rebuilding. Meanwhile, largely thanks to the protection of the oceans, the United States was the world's largest creditor and was sitting on the throne as the richest and most powerful country of all time. Half of the planet's wealth was in its hands. They owned 75% of the world's gold reserves. But even before the war ended, in 1944, 44 countries gathered in a small city in the United States, Bretton Woods. A new world order was born there, a system that seemed to promise stability but already carried in its DNA a seed of domination. The world's currencies would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate and the dollar to gold also at a fixed rate of $35 per troy ounce. In theory, this would guarantee trust and balance in the international financial system, and for a while it worked. The next 30 years became known as the golden age of capitalism, economic growth, employment, massive development of new technologies. From the United States to Western Europe, even parts of Latin America and East Asia, the world prospered under the rules of Bretton Woods. But there was an invisible crack in this system, a fundamental flaw that the Belgian economist Robert Triffin was one of the first to predict. His discovery became known as the Triffin dilemma. In a lecture given to the American Congress, he prophesied that the system had a flaw.
If you want growth in trade and production to avoid unemployment and everything else, you also need growth in money. To pay more, you need more money, and to pay more internationally, you need more international money. And if you didn't have that growth, if the growth of reserves was no longer fueled by the United States deficit, the world would go into deflation. That was one side of the dilemma. The other side was that if the growth of global reserves depended on an adequate volume of American deficits, the United States dollar would start facing problems, and the United States would no longer be able to convert the growing piles of foreign dollars into ever smaller piles of gold at Fort Knox.
So, a structural trap of the Bretton Woods system was exposed. It was an impossible game. Either the United States saved the system or saved itself. And they, of course, chose the second option. The former president of France, Charles de Gaulle, as seen in his indignant speech, would call the system a scandal, a country that could buy the world by printing paper. An exorbitant privilege that turned the United States into monetary gods and the rest of the planet into hostages of its eternal debt.
The fact that many states, in principle, accept dollars in the same way they would accept gold to settle the difference that exists for their benefit in the balance of payments of the United States. In fact, this leads Americans to borrow and to borrow for free from foreigners. Because what they owe, they pay, or at least part of it, with dollars they can print at will.
I know it seems confusing to understand all this, but to better understand this exorbitant privilege, it's necessary to understand how a country's currency works. The current account is the record of all financial transactions that a country carries out with others. In short, it measures the country's imports and exports. In general, countries that have a current account deficit are usually poor or considered developing, precisely because the country has to go into debt to cover the deficits. The exception to the rule is precisely the United States. They can operate with astronomical deficits, and even so, keep the country's economic health strong and steady.
In most countries, the poor countries of the global south, the standard of living of workers drops because they can no longer afford to pay for their imports, so their currencies depreciate against the dollar. But the United States is buying its imports with its own currency. If the United States wants to buy foreign cars, oil, or any technology they want now, the United States can simply print those dollars to import these products and then export inflation to the rest of the world. This is the exorbitant privilege of the United States dollar.
This, in practice, shows that the United States economy has lived and is actually living off the wealth produced by other economies around the world. This was one of the reasons that, in 1980, led the United States to deindustrialize and export its factories to the world. The idea was to produce where wages were lower and consequently to be able to import everything they consume much more cheaply. This benefited many Americans and they greatly enjoyed their exorbitant privilege. They financed wars, research, and the development of new military and space technologies which pushed them to the top of the most developed countries in the world. All for the privilege of printing money and exporting inflation. But in 1971, the United States had gold reserves in Fort Knox equivalent to $10 billion. But there were about $60 billion circulating in the world. That means the number of dollars in circulation was much greater than the equivalent in gold. In other words, a complicated situation that would put at risk the existence of the system they set up at Bretton Woods, which would therefore end their excessive privilege. But the United States had an ace to handle this problem. It was August 15, 1971. That Sunday night, President Richard Nixon appeared on television. Without consulting allies, without prior warning, he simply broke the agreement. Nixon announced the end of the dollar's convertibility into gold, and he even had the nerve to call the measure a temporary solution against speculators.
The strength of a nation's currency depends on the strength of that nation's economy, and the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. That's why I have ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to take the necessary measures to defend the dollar against speculators. I've directed Secretary Connolly to temporarily halt converting the dollar into gold.
The next day, the world woke up without the gold standard or an anchor. However, the system did not collapse as expected, because all the countries were already tied to the dollar, like addicts to a drug. They knew they were being exploited, but they couldn't break free. There's an even more ingenious trick, almost invisible to the eyes of the public. A trick that even turns the export of Brazilian oil into a machine to finance the American empire. Here's how it works. When Petrobras sells oil, it gets paid in dollars, but those dollars don't stay with it long. To pay salaries, suppliers, and taxes in Brazil, it needs to convert them into reais, and that's when the game begins. It sells the dollars to a Brazilian bank, which would create a tendency for the real to appreciate. The bank then gives the dollars to the central bank, which wants to avoid excessive real appreciation, because that would harm Brazilian exports. Remember, the higher the dollar, the better the scenario for Brazilian exporters. So, the central bank, applying its monetary policy, buys these dollars, but it's not going to let them sit idle in an account either. It reinvests them. Guess where? In United States Treasury bonds. In other words, Brazil sells oil and the money comes back to finance the United States government. Of course, that was a simplified example, but this really happens. This is what the economist Michael Hudson called the free lunch system. The United States imports goods, exports dollars, and receives back investments in its own debt securities, which serve, among other things, to finance its very high military budget.
There was a new way to control the world and abandon gold. In fact, it had consolidated American dominance, because by forcing other central banks to stop buying gold, What was left for them? All they could do was recycle the surplus dollars they were receiving by buying United States Treasury bonds, because that's what central banks buy. They buy government bonds.
And they do this with the whole world, especially with Japan, because all countries are trapped in this dependence on floating exchange rates. A vicious cycle that makes the rest of the world work, export, and sweat to maintain the privilege of a single nation. And if you think the process of American domination comes down to just that, you're deeply mistaken. Slavery didn't just affect poor countries. Although, until 1971, the United States saw its country progress insanely and form a minimally decent middle class, nowadays, ordinary people have become servants of an invisible system. Since 1971, productivity has skyrocketed, but wages have stagnated. The price of houses has risen absurdly. The richest 1% grabbed almost all the economic growth, while the average American sank into debt, rent, health plans, and hopelessness. Only the rich kept getting richer. Thomas Piketty wrote, "When the rate of return on capital exceeds the growth of the economy, inequality inevitably increases." And that's exactly what we see. Growth for a few, stagnation for many. Silent slavery. And what if I told you that this video you're watching right now isn't everything? There's a part of the story that YouTube wouldn't look kindly upon. It's the kind of content that can't be on regular YouTube. For that, I put together an exclusive video showing how the United States secretly, behind the scenes at the White House, created the biggest political scandal in its history. With weapons, cocaine, and funding from their own enemy, all with the support of the CIA. It's available now, but only for channel members. Click on join and enter the club. Besides supporting an independent channel, you'll understand the real world, something few people want to see. On average, it takes me about a month and a half to produce a video with the level of depth I deliver here on the channel. So, if you like my content, and on top of that, you want to stay up to date with content that's too controversial to be made public here on YouTube, then click now to become a channel member. To discover one of the darkest chapters of the world's most powerful nation.